this little bit in brackets. So Resh is Chochmah.
Okay. So now he is going to explain what happens when a person does something that's forbidden. Okay. What does it mean that avonotechem avdilim? So it creates a barrier between the person and godliness. Now, what does this look like? So he says one example is what we saw yesterday, that when you blow something up, there's some kind of barrier so that the air can't pass. It can't extend.
It's like putting a cup upside down under the tap. You don't get anything comes inside.
The second example he gives now is that it's not, what kind of barrier is this? That's what he wants to explain. What type of barrier? So the barrier here is that the divine light, meaning the energy, the divine energy, is going to be caught up in a garment. A type of garment.
It's trapped.
It creates a garment. What do we mean? So he says like this.
Which divine?
Inun mechitza
The
bereshit
person is
chokhmah.
trying to give you the
What?
What divine energy? The energy.
When you do something wrong, what happens? So the divine energy that was supposed to come down to you is now going to be locked up, or that gave you life is now going to be locked up in a barrier.
When a person goes to do an event, it does something. There was no divine energy coming down. You mean the divine energy was keeping you alive at the time?
Good. The Elokim part.
But if it
My
gets
life
taken
force.
away, then the person stops.
It's
being
not
alive.
being taken away. It's being locked into something else. So let's read. Ubereshit chokhmah, it says like this. Inun mechitza ben Yisrael avim shebashamayim, gar min afrashuta, ben kutsh abrichu v'Yisrael, v'dai uraza, ki im avonatechem hayu mavdilim ad kan leshono. So what does he mean to say? He says, these klipas, we call them klipa, call them a husk. That when a person does something wrong, he's feeding the husk. What does it mean he's feeding the husk? So he says here, he's taking from the divine energy, the life force that's giving him life, and he's locking it away like in a bank account. But in this case, it's being locked away in a husk.
He's misusing it.
Well, he's not just misusing it. He's causing it, whatever this
He's
life
sending
force
it somewhere
was,
else.
to be added to this husk that surrounds him.
Okay, and how does he get out of there?
Wait, hold on. ומה שכתב גר מן הפרשות המובן, כי כשההשפעה נמשכת על ידי לבוש שק, גס ועב, אין גילוי אלוקות בעולם, כי לבוש גס זה מסתיר לגמרי על הגוף. So it says now what he means, that he causes it to be excluded, means that he's giving this energy off to what we call a levush sak. Sak in general, sackcloth, is a picture of the klipa. It's one of the pictures, because what do you make sackcloth out of? You make it out of the chaff that was left after you took the wheat out. Okay? So you make it out of these strands, the worst strands that there are. So when somebody wore a sackcloth, for instance, in times of mourning or in times of distress or whatever it was like to give a picture of how he's locked, how he feels that he's locked, or we're locked as a community, as a people. We're locked within the product of our transgressions. They've made us wear a sackcloth. It's just very.
Are you talking here about a deliberate affair, or are you talking about an inadvertent?
It doesn't matter. In any case, the energy is gone. It's very interesting. I just read, I was reading this morning William James, his book on psychology. He wrote the biggest volume ever on psychology, which is, in and of itself, it's a very interesting book. It's very instrumental. He doesn't try to give a theory of the psyche. He's very American, very pragmatic. He's not interested in theories. He's more in what can I empirically see. So he says it's very interesting that if you would tell somebody, you can choose between having a blemished body. I guess what he means is like a body that has all kinds of warts and things and this and that, and between having beautiful clothing your whole life. He says it's there's no doubt what most people would choose.
Any day.
Today, nobody would choose that.
No,
I don't-
everybody would choose beautiful clothes.
Really? Today you think people would choose beautiful clothing?
Who wants blemishes on their body?
No, it's either this or that.
Yes, I'm saying, why would anybody choose blemished body? They choose beautiful clothing.
You have to choose between the two. You're going to get one or the other.
Okay.
Either you will have a blemished body,
Yeah.
okay, but you'll be able to cover it
Ah,
with
okay.
beautiful clothing,
Yeah.
or you'll have a beautiful body
Okay.
and blemished clothing.
Okay.
Which do you prefer?
Like I said, you see,
In
they
his
walking
time-
around with torn clothes.
In his time, there's no people. The problem that they had was how they presented themselves externally. So there's a big question if people even understand this metaphor today.
Right.
If you
They
say
are
this
always
today,
torn jeans, you know. I say to them, would you like some money to buy some new clothes? You know?
but it's even much more than that, because it's not just that the fashion is like to wear something that's torn or to wear little, right? It's not just a modesty problem. It's a way the person envisions himself. The identity is no longer as much as it was in clothing as it was in the time of the Alter Rebbe. I'm talking about in 1900 when William James wrote his big book on psychology, an introduction to psychology. So it was still that way. People saw that the way they presented themselves, their clothing was an inherent part of their identity. And today it's much less, far less.
No, it's still a part of their identity. but they
Very
have a
weak,
different
very
identity.
weak.
They have a different concept of what
The
identity
concept
is.
right now is much more on the body itself. So it's interesting that in Kabbalah, really, it's not talked about as a levush gas in the sense of a vestment. It's not a garment. It's talked about as the body itself has what we call a malbush. The body itself has an aura around it. That's the only way I can call it. It's not the aura that they talk about in telekinesis and all that stuff, the parapsychology. It's an aura in the sense that where I would say it's almost like habits. Okay? It's almost like how you carry yourself, how you're used to seeing yourself. Really, in the end, it's self-image. It's probably what we call self-image. And so your self-image becomes tainted. And the moment that your self-image becomes tainted by sin, by an avera, then it's like you're locked into this pattern that you can't leave. So I think that's really the best way to understand it. That when you do an avera, you're strengthening the negative self-image that you have of yourself. And even if you don't think it's an avera, that's what it does to you. So, for instance, if a person doesn't have confidence, okay, why doesn't a person have self-confidence? Where did it go? Where did it go? So certainly it could be that people hurt him and his parents weren't very supportive or anything like that. But David's parents weren't supportive either. King David's parents were probably the least supportive parents in the world, ever. The worst possible. Not because they were bad people, because of the situation that they were in. And so he constantly felt that he had nothing to rely on in this world. And yet he had the most self-confidence out of anybody alive, maybe. He did things that nobody else was able to do. Where did he get that? So we haven't talked about it, but he said there's a pasuk that he says, and the Ramchal analyzes in what is probably the first example of Chassidus ever. Right? It's before the Baal Shem Tov. And he says, there's a pasuk that says in Tehillim, Elchatz benikayon kapai, v'asoveva mizbachacha Hashem. I will wash my hands with cleanliness, and then I will encircle your altar, God. How does the Ramchal explain this? He says that if a person is clean of sin, he has the ability to walk around the altar, which is a symbol for self-confidence. How he gets to it, why he gets to it, it's not so important. But he said this is a Hasidic interpretation.
walks around the altar because he's not mitbayesh from Kodesh
Can,
Baruch Hu,
yes,
right.
right.
Therefore he has
Right.
self-confidence.
So much so that David says to Hashem, don't get involved. I'll chase my enemies. Don't bother me. So much so, he says, you put me on this earth to serve you, let me serve you. Don't get involved. Don't help me. I don't want help. It's a very interesting thing. You usually wouldn't associate that. I mean, a Hasidic mindset would say, what do you mean? I need help with everything. So no, David doesn't see himself that way.
It was the whole sippur of the Tzemach Tzedek. The Alter Rebbe wanted to give him a bracha, and he said, no, I want to do it by myself. And then he was sorry forever afterwards.
Said so with the
Did David HaMelech show regret on that?
No, because he won against all his enemies. Apparently, winning against enemies is not the same thing as receiving a bracha. Winning against your enemies, meaning against the Yetzer Hara, you want to win by yourself. But when it comes to having new levels, I mean, it's sort of like saying that if you take that away from the person, the fact that they fought, it's not saying that they have all the strength that they need, a lot of the strength they receive from Hashem. But the decision that I'm going to pursue my enemies and not give up until I conquer them, okay, that requires a lot. That is really what you were put on this earth for in a personal sense. Okay? Then you have your bigger mission in life. But in a personal sense, in the sense of your own development, that's something that you can really say that's my mission in life. So David said, no, don't touch me. Where did he get, says the Ramchal, where did he get this confidence that he can do it all by himself? Because after him, all the kings asked for help. They couldn't pursue their enemies anymore. So he got it, he says, from his cleanliness. Because he was completely pure from any sin he had done. How can you say that? David, not only did he sin, but say the sages that he's the exemplar of a Baal Teshuvah, of somebody who returns to God. He's the example. So how can you say he never sinned? No, he did, but he cleansed himself so much from what he did wrong, okay, that it was like he was in a completely clean garment entirely. So again, what's the idea? The idea is that self-confidence is related to your self-image. That when you do an Avera, even if you are not religious, even if you don't understand what the nature of an Avera is, in the end, every single one of the Averos, every single one of the sins that the Torah talks about, the lotas, the prohibitive, is a category of tainting the self-image. And that's why I call it like habits or patterns. It's the way you see yourself. Okay? The way, I can't do those things. That's too much for me. Or I'm already used to the fact that I do this sin repeatedly. It's already permitted for me because there's a pattern in my life. I've never been able to overcome it. And people give up on things. They don't understand that. You know what? Even if you have a habit, if you've created a transgression that's become a habit, and you think you're addicted to it, you can't get rid of it. Things change. Don't give up.
It's a very interesting letter from the Rebbe about somebody who wrote to the Rebbe that he has a problem with can't break this Avera that is into it. Whatever it is, how you can break it.
What does he say?
Look, and then contemplate it, think about it very deeply, and then make a firm resolution. No, that's how beautiful.
See, so I'm now talking to some guy in England. So we don't really talk that much. We correspond. So he has all kinds of addictions and things. I write English. The question is whether the English speak English. Sometimes you wonder. One of the things we've been talking about, we've been writing about, is the value of self-nullification. The self-nullification has the power to reset the self-image, if only for a moment, for a short time. And when you use self-nullification in that way, and you immediately try to create a good habit, a good self-image, during those moments of reset. Again, what self-nullification means, that it's like what it says about David, that he killed it. He had a self-image, he had an evil inclination, and he killed it through fasting. What do you mean he killed it? So we talked about this. You can't kill it forever. You kill it for a few hours. Okay? And then when you kill it for a few hours, you use that time to rebuild your self-image in a different sense. So for instance, a person is, let's say a person is addicted, and then he falls. He carries out, he satisfies his addiction, whatever it might be. But then in between, there are some moments that he's able to overcome.
Step back and look at himself and realize
He knows where he is. If during that time he doesn't just feel remorse, which is good in and of itself maybe, but I don't know if it's going to help him. I don't know if feeling remorse when you're addicted to something really helps you. I think it only gives you guilt feelings, and those are no good. So instead of that, using those moments to come and do something else. For instance, you said, the Rebbe said, go do tzedakah. That's self-nullification. Because I'm coming and I'm saying, I'm going to do something that I wouldn't do for myself. Right? My behavior doesn't include going out, I don't know, to buy some food for somebody and bring them on the street or anything like that. The fact that you do it the fact that you're able to do that, and during those hours, or minutes, or whatever it is, however much time you have, you strengthen your image as someone who does tzedakah. That begins to change the self-image. And it takes years. It could take years. But eventually it changes, because even the cravings weaken. Even the cravings are not the same when you're 60 or 50 as they were when you were 30 and 20. They weaken. It's not that they don't go away. We have less strength for them. Less patience for them. You want to do other things. So if you kept building up another image of the self, it eventually takes over. And I think that in that sense, but that's what he's saying here in terms of the teshuvah. That's what he's going to say now. וזהו עניין עוונותיכם היו מבדילים, שהם הגורמים התלבשות השפעת השכינה ב10 ספירות דנוגה, זהו המחיצה המפסקת. In Kabbalah, this is called that the Shekhinah is now captured. It is now enclosed in the 10 spheres of the klipa of Noga, right? Of the husk of Noga. And as we know, the Noga is like an intermediary, but it's not really an intermediary. It's an intermediary in the sense that it's not prohibited. Having a self-image, it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah, you shouldn't think about yourself. I've never seen such a verse.
This Noga and Klippas Noga is the same thing?
Yeah.
Or something else?
Yeah, same thing. Noga means that this is it's relatively external to the person himself. That's why we call it a self-image. It's an image, it's not the person himself. It's how you project yourself. Another way of saying Noga would be like the light of the projection. That's why we call it an aura. But again, it raises, the moment I use that word, every time I use that word, everybody thinks I'm talking about parapsychology. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what you call the projection of the self. There is sometimes they call it the residual self. But it's a picture of who I am. It's a picture of my identity that I have in my mind. It's not my real self, but it's the picture that I have. And that's a projection. And it's sort of like, what we mean is that it's around me. It's not exactly me. It's the only way to picture it is, it's like how I picture myself. It's like if I would it's like maybe the shadow that I cast, in a certain sense. So this is called Noga. And what he's saying is that instead of the Shekhinah, instead of God's presence being what is palpable, what is present in you, it becomes trapped in the self-image, which also means that your energy is focused more and more on the self-image and less on who you really are. And so you begin to be captured in the self-image, in this aura around you, in this projection that you have of yourself. And you can't tell the difference. You mama see people who are so worried about their image. Right? You talk about somebody who's famous.
Donald Trump.
Why him? I mean, every single celebrity in the world.
He's obsessed with it.
They're all obsessed with themselves. They're obsessed to the point where they don't know who they are. Meaning, a lot of them say there's two I. There's the I of the image, the celebrityhood, and there's the I that I don't really know anymore, which is me when I'm by myself, but because they're never by themselves, or they're almost never by themselves. So they lose that real self, who they really are. So anytime that you do an Avera, what it's saying is it's shifting your energy. It's taking away from your energy, which was supposed to be focused on who you are, to some projection of yourself. And that's called Noga, that's called the husk. And that's what psychologically happens. How do you remedy this? והעניין כי יעקב חבל נחלתו, ועל ידי שאדם משפיל את עצמו להימשך אחר התאוות הגשמיים באיסור, אפילו בהיתר שנמשכים ביכולות הקליפות, גורם בזה למעלה כמו כן התלבשות, השפעת השם תתה בעשר ספירות, וכשעושה תשובה ועוקר רצונו מאבלי העולם, גורם כן למעלה בחינת תשוב ה' תתה למקורה, וזהו עניין ברוך אתה השם אלוקינו, שאזי אין מבדיל בין האדם ובין אלוקינו. So he says, the remedy is, like we learned yesterday, we began to actually look at this yesterday, it's interesting how he built it here, that godliness should be in me, not in my image. Now he really explained what does it mean that Elokai b'kirbi, that I have a connection with the life force in me. In other words, that the life force is not being expended on creating a projection of myself. The life force is spent on living. It's what people call being present sometimes. That's why we call it the divine presence. Okay? Because the divine presence is God being present in you. And so your energies can be focused on what needs to be done and not on what you think people will see in you or the way you project yourself. Okay? The moment that you're busy with your image, that means you're locked into the klipa. You're locked into noga. You're locked into this husk. Okay?
Always?
Yeah.
But if I want to go to do a mitzvah, take the example of being a tzaddik kedusha. I want to do a mitzvah. So therefore I'll make sure that when I go, I'll have my hat and I'll be clean. And I'll have my kapot and it'll be clean. And my shoes will be shine. Because I want to give an image of a frum Jew who's serious, right? But when I get home, I take all those off. That's because you want to carve people.
And what do you know about yourself?
You're a real bomb, you know.
So it's not the self-image.
But you're not presenting that self-image for bad reasons. You're doing it for a good reason.
That's not a self-image. That's a projection for the mitzvah. Because I want the mitzvah to be respected. Because I want the wedding to be respected. I want the ritual to be respected. That's the ritual. It's not me.
Okay.
If you think that because I wear these clothing that makes me into a holy man, you're gravely mistaken. I'm not a holy man. If somebody comes and asks you, because there are people, miskinim, nebuch, there are people who are rabbis, and they think that because they put on some hat, they became holy. No, you didn't become holy. You're still you. Why do we do this? Because we want there to be respect for the Torah. We want there to be respect for the. But that's not self-image. That's the image of the Torah. That's a projection of Yiddishkeit. It's a completely different thing. The moment you begin to confuse them, it means that you're doing an avera. That's exactly good. So
the trick is to know where you are and where you stand.
The trick is to know that underneath these garments, I'm still Joe Schmo. I'm nothing. I'm still nothing. Nothing changed. That's what he calls shiftless. That's what he calls. Okay. And again, what he says, what he just said in this paragraph, I don't want to get into it because it's a big topic, but just as you invested yourself, literally invested, put yourself in your clothing, in your image, and you made yourself into a chitzoini, you made yourself into somebody who's interested in the external projection of yourself. You do the same thing to godliness. And godliness now is locked in the external manner. Meaning, if we feel that the rabbinical world, let's say, is too involved in its honor and in its importance and self-importance and this and that, we should know that the reason for that is because we act that way. Meaning, if we think that the world is too involved in superfluous external things, purchasing a lot of things, consumerism, not seeing what's the main part of life, and wasting life on Amazon, I don't know, let's say, and all this on glamour. If we see that's the way the world is, we have to know that we made it that way. We, the Jewish people, we're responsible for it. Why are we responsible for it? Because nobody else was given the mitzvahs. Nobody else was told, use divine presence to live and not to create a projection. But when you use it to create a projection, that's what happens to godliness also. Godliness also becomes something external. Right away after the temple was destroyed, right away in terms of human lifetime, wasn't exactly right away, but in terms of a few generations, it was right away. The church in Rome rose to greatness, and everything became external. And everything that in the Beis HaMikdash was essential, was something that was dealing with the core of the matter. What does it mean to serve God? Became suddenly some kind of show. And the church became ostentatious. It became, everything is in gold, but not to serve God, but it's all to impress people, to create an image. And it became an image. It was so bad that it became an actual image. That God became an image. Here's the image of God. What did you just do? You became an idolater. Okay? In the end, idolatry, by definition, it's not misplaced. It's not anti-religious. Idolatry is very religious. It comes from what we call the homo religioso, okay? the religious aspect of man. But it's an external manifestation of that need of man to connect to God. And it becomes that really the idol is not an external representation of God. It's much worse. It's the projection of the self. That's really what idolatry is about. Now that requires a lot of discussion. But every idol, and you can see this in India. If you go to India, I haven't been to India, but I have so many friends who are shluchim there and are there all year long. And the God that, right, with the lowercase g that each one has on his dashboard in his car, he has a little idol. Buddha is the general God, but they have all kinds of other idols as well, Krishna and this and that, and they have pictures of them. Every person chooses it really as an expression of themselves. They really understand it that way. They're not, they're blind to the fact that it's sort of ridiculous that you're worshiping yourself, because they don't exactly see it that way. They say, no, this is a projection, in the same way like by the Native Americans, by the Indians. There was every person identified with a certain animal spirit. And what they said was that the animal spirit exists anyway, and I identify with it. They don't see that really the animal spirit, nobody can, if there is such a thing, there probably is, but you don't really identify with it. What you do is you project yourself onto that. That would require years of analysis to get a person to acknowledge that that's what they're doing.
Yofi.
Okay. What time is it?
9:54.
Okay. So now we came to the second teshuvah. And the second teshuvah we said is about Beseto. Now it's no longer about doing a transgression. It's about having missed out on a prescriptive mitzvah, something I could have done. And the most important one of everything is limud Torah, is learning Torah. But it's also with saying Shema, and it's also giving tzedakah, and it's also helping somebody, and all the things that could be a prescriptive mitzvah. And the person missed the boat. He didn't do it. He's lazy, as he says here. Even though the person refrains from doing anything that's prohibited, but he does not do as many prescriptive commandments as he could have. ליגע את עצמו בתורה ותפילה, היינו עצלות. Because he's lazy. In the end, he's lazy. So what do we do with this laziness? So we also have to do teshuvah about this laziness. Okay, so we'll continue, I guess, tomorrow.
Bezrat Hashem.
Shkoyach for coming, even though it was difficult.
Bezrat Hashem.